I gotta fix my button first, cause I want this button and one it ain't. Are you gonna take all these outtakes and make something awesome out of them?
Maybe.
I think I deleted the very first one, like once I got it.
Shame.
Yeah. Where's the actual camera? The camera's right here, right there. So that's what we gotta look at. Because I've learned that if you look at yourself, you're not look. It's gonna look like you're looking off to the side. So,
Yeah.
all right, we're gonna get started.
Okay.
Hey, welcome again to the gospel, which is good news for everyone. We are now in our third week,
Third week.
third installment. As you'll notice on this side, I have a friend who's joining me. This is my wife, Emily,
Hello.
and she's going to be kind of facilitating our conversation here. She's going to ask some questions, and so maybe this will look a little bit differently, or again, like I said, maybe a little more engaging. And so this week we're looking at justifying grace. So now Emily's going to kind of facilitate our conversation and hopefully ask some very useful questions and maybe keep me in line and on task. So take it away.
Sure. So the first thing that I wanted you to do was just take a step back and define what is prevenient grace.
Gotcha.
So that's because that's the first step before you get to justifying grace. You have had to experience prevenient grace. Tell us what that is.
Yeah, so prevenient grace is the grace of God that goes before us. And what that means practically is that we believe that God is at work in our lives before we knew Him. And, as fallen and broken people, people that are marred and affected by sin, we believe that we need an act of God in our life to even help us understand and recognize our need for grace. And so it is a gracious act of God, His prevenient grace, that reaches into our life while we were still sinners.
So to try to make this tangible and personal for our groups, can you think of an example in your life that's more personal and maybe even tangible where God's prevenient grace was at work in you?
Sure. I think for me, God's grace was most tangible at the moment where I first learned to trust Him or felt that He was near. There was a time in my life when I felt far away from Him. And, I was, in fact, I was at summer camp, or it wasn't summer camp, it was during the fall, but it was at Camp Wesley Pines. And there was a deep sense in my heart that I was broken and in need of God's grace. And looking back on that, I realized that that was God at work in me, bringing me to that point. At the time, maybe I might have thought it was the preacher and what he was saying and that kind of thing. But the reality is it was God's hand at work in my life, stirring in my heart, more or less breaking my heart in a way, so that I recognized that I desperately needed salvation. I needed Jesus. And to even then let me know that there was hope. That's what prevenient grace is to me and for me and how I experienced it.
Sure. So prevenient grace is the grace that comes before that kind of draws us closer to
Sure.
who God is. You said last week grace always moves us closer to the heart of God.
Sure.
This past Sunday we talked about justifying grace. Can you give us a definition of justifying grace?
Sure. Justifying grace is God's grace that sets us in right standing with God. And so the first part of that, God's grace, just as a reminder, is God's unmerited, undeserved love and favor for us that not only, in prevenient grace pursues us, in justifying grace, it is God's action to make us right. And of course, that's made possible in Christ, that Jesus worked on the cross to take the sin of the world, my sin, your sin, and to essentially crucify it and bury it at the cross, sets us right with God because He's paid the penalty, the price, made the atonement for our sin. And so therefore, when we experience justifying grace, it is the grace that realigns or makes us right with God.
Okay. So whereas prevenient grace feels like something that's happening a long time over time, justifying grace I think could be the same way, but also points to like a particular moment, I think, for a lot of people when there might have been all these things leading up, but then a particular moment where you recognized justifying grace was real, or you saw God's grace at work and knew that you needed to take a step into that grace.
Sure.
Can you think of a time in your life where you took a step into justifying grace?
Yeah, I'll go back to that moment when I was at camp. That was a moment where not only did I recognize my need for God's grace, I felt that in that moment, with a simple act of faith on my behalf, that God's grace was sufficient. It was enough. And I was made right, and I was made whole, and I was made new in that moment. I also recognized that everything wasn't perfect at that moment, but I felt redeemed by God. I felt like God saw me as his own, and I felt like he had imparted a righteousness in me that began to grow at that moment. And so you're right, prevenient grace kind of goes along for a season, and I believe God's prevenient grace is at work in our life from the very beginning. I believe there comes a point in our life where we recognize God's grace is sufficient to right us from our wrong. But I believe that is not an end. That's a beginning point, really, and something we'll talk about next week, and of how once we receive that justifying grace, what then God does through another form of his grace, sanctifying grace, and leads us toward being made right back into that perfect image that we were initially created in.
So on Sunday morning at the well, we sang a song called Cornerstone. Mm-hmm. Cornerstone is a modern worship song, but the words from it, the verses, are based on a hymn. And the third verse of that song talks about like when Jesus is coming back in power. And this is how the third verse goes. It says, "When he shall come with trumpet sound, oh may I then in him be found, dressed in his righteousness alone, faultless stand before the throne." And I think what that verse is kind of hitting an idea that you had later on in the sermon, where Jesus doesn't just hide us, like we don't just crawl behind him and we're still sinful, but that he actually makes us righteous completely. Like he takes all that away and makes us new. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, and I think this is something that is unique specifically to Christianity in the Wesleyan tradition, and I think it sort of sets this understanding of grace apart, especially as we look forward to next week and think about God's sanctifying grace that continues to shape us. This is Romans chapter 3, verse 22. We are made right, or you could say justified. We're made righteous with God by placing our faith in Christ Jesus. And this is true for everyone who believes, no matter who we are. For everyone has sinned. We all fall short of God's glorious standard. Yet God, with undeserved kindness, declares that we are righteous. He did this through Jesus Christ when he freed us from the penalty of our sin. For God presented Jesus as the sacrifice for sin. People are made right or justified with God when they believe that Jesus sacrificed his life, shedding his blood. What I think Paul is getting at in this moment is that it obviously is not our work, but it's God's work. It's his graciousness that is a gift to us. And it is, when we place our faith in Jesus, we receive his righteousness. And in fact, all of our unrighteousness has been placed on Christ and crucified on the cross. And so like the lyrics say, we really do stand faultless before the throne of God. And that's an incredible thought to consider, that when we stand before God one day, and I believe that we all will, that, granted it's only going to be by the grace of Jesus, but I believe that Jesus wants to transform us. I have a hard time believing that God simply wants to camouflage us in his grace. I think he really wants to restore and redeem that which was broken at the fall. And not just to have us ready for presentation at the moment in which we meet God, but also so that we might be of use in ushering in the kingdom here and now.
So we're wrapping this up. We want the groups to have conversation. What is the main question or main takeaway that you want the groups to talk about now?
Yeah, I mean, there's some questions in your guide, but ultimately, like, especially with this particular understanding of grace, the proper response to God's justifying grace is surrender, is to receive it. And so, as simple as it may sound, I think step number one, the major, most important next step you can take is to trust Jesus, to place your faith in Christ, that his work on the cross is enough to bring you salvation in the fullness, to redeem your life, to take your unrighteousness away and place the righteousness of Christ in you. And if you've done that, that's fantastic. If you've not truly crossed over and really trusted in Christ, there's no better moment than right now to do that. And there are people sitting around you who would love nothing more than to pray with you and to walk you through receiving that grace first and foremost, even in this moment. And so I think the first and most important takeaway is trust in God's justifying grace. Maybe you've already done that, and I think for folks like that who already have, perhaps a next step might be, how can I begin to articulate that work of God in my life so that it might benefit someone else? And so one of the suggestions in your guide may be to journal something down, maybe to share your story with someone else. But there's ways of not simply, of receiving God's justifying grace, but also by sharing that with someone else. And I believe we all benefit from that when you do.
All right. So we hope you have a great group.
Yeah.
Wrap up.
Yeah, we hope you have a good group. I hope this
is real life.
was helpful.
Also,
we appreciate
our dog's
you.
on the couch with us in case you missed that note. She's snoozing. Aww. Maybe your dog's on the couch with you at your group too. I don't know.
Yeah, we hope you guys have a great time, and thank you for carving out the time to be here and to do this. We believe this is the most important thing that we do. We love Sunday mornings, but the work that you're willing to do, to be vulnerable with one another, to share in your own struggles, but also to encourage one another in your group time, I believe will grow us not only as individuals but as a church in ways that we're not going to do in any other way. So thank you for the time you're putting into this. I pray and I trust that God's going to bless you for that. So have a great week.
See you Sunday.
Peace out.